So, hello everyone, I'm Michael Araki. We are here at the APA with Angela Cotalessa and Robert Root-Bernstein and Michele Root-Bernstein for a conversation. And now Angela is going to have the words and ask some questions to them.
Yeah, so hi everyone, I'm Dr. Angela Cotalessa, and it's been a real honor to be on a panel earlier today with Bob and Michele Root-Bernstein. So to start, why don't you each tell us a little bit about your background?
You want me to go first? Sure. Okay. Well, I guess I'll start with I got a PhD in history a long time ago, and has since been something of an independent scholar. At some point, I took up with Bob studying creativity, and he thought that was interesting. I think actually Bob started it off because of some work he did as a graduate student, and subsequently looking at science as how they think, how they discover, and then we would talk about it at home, and then I realized, artists are doing the same thing, dancers are doing the same thing, people I was more interested in than scientists. And so eventually we realized there was a commonality in creativity, so we decided to focus and write a book. And so that's history. Then we started doing more and more working in the field. So, and I should just say also, well, maybe I shouldn't say no, but I'm also, so I do that, and I raised a family, and I'm also a Meccan poet.
And I'm Bob Root-Bernstein, and I'm a professor of physiology, Michigan State University. Probably the only scientist in the world who has a PhD in history running a laboratory, which gives you some idea of how odd my background is. I started out as a biochemist. Was very unhappy with my training. I thought it was much too narrow. I've always been a fairly broad thinker, and decided I was very excited about history of science, so I ended up getting a history degree, trying to understand what the major developments were in science, figuring I could take my degree and get back into science afterwards, having no idea how difficult that would end up being, having a history degree and trying to get into a laboratory. I ended up probably getting interested in what we now think of as polymath studies, simply because my brother challenged me when I decided to go into history of science and said, why would you want to study history of science when you can do science? And I thought about that fairly hard for a while and realized that the answer, which had been at the back of my mind, but I'd never actually stated, was that I wanted to learn from history and philosophy of science what was relevant to a working scientist. And so I focused very specifically on studying scientists who I could get into their laboratory notebooks and their letters and things like that, and get a sense of their creative process and see how that was different than the average scientist, or at least the way that I'd been trained. And then I wanted to take that and then bring it back to the laboratory. So I ended up being very lucky. Jonas Salk gave me a postdoc, allowed me back in the lab, and I still was doing some history of science as well. So the idea of scientific creativity became a focus, and as I studied the scientists more intently, the more I realized they were very broadly trained and interested in everything. And before long, I knew I was studying polymaths, and that's where that all started.
Two quick notes. By the way, your supervisor was Thomas Kuhn.
Right?
Noteworthy. And the second thing is that in nowadays, in the current discussion, we are having this discussion about the utility of studying history or arts or whatever when you can be a scientist. And it's like this discussion is hot now, but it's been important in the past. Would you like to comment a little bit on that?
Sure. So, I think we actually got a question earlier today at the session about interdisciplinarity and things like that. And one of the things I pointed out was that history of science actually it's interdisciplinary in the sense that it is technically history and science put together, except it's not really a bridge, which is one of the first surprises I got in graduate school. I really thought that you would learn history and you would learn science and you'd find this bridge between them, not realizing history of science had been around almost 100 years and was its own specialty. And its own language was actually different than history, and it was different than science, and it was now its own niche in between. And that's actually one of the further spurs that I've had in trying to think about what polymathy is and how it's different than just interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, and all sorts of terms out there about the way that you can connect things. And one of the things I immediately, maybe because I had that lens focused on, was the number of scientists who very specifically said that they thought history was very important to their science, or philosophy was very important to their science, or the arts were very important, in some cases, all these things. In fact, one of the strange things is that the specific people I was studying in my PhD dissertation founded the field of physical chemistry, but all of them were also the founders of the field of history of science, which is really kind of interesting. And they were all artists or musicians, so they were directly addressing all the issues that we're talking about here.
I wanted to point out too, I think, if I understand correctly, Scott Barry Kaufman's latest work on polymathy, it struck me that maybe what's motivating that, or what's of interest there, is that a lot of the people that they were talking to, I think, in that symposium were academics who were polymaths, but a way of trying to understand what's the difference between being a polymath and being someone who's simply interdisciplinary. Because some of the people that they had on that panel were clearly not in between. They were trying to do two things that were, still separate. At least the way we conceive of them, philosophy, novel writing. We still conceive of that as separate. It's not an in-between thing. So
That's a great segue into my next question, which is, how would you define polymathy?
Well, we have a standard definition that we're working with right now, but it's a working definition. Right. And that is that, first of all, that we're trying to figure out whether you need to distinguish between polymathy and creative polymathy. Maybe not, but realizing there's a range in the phenomenon. But basically, I'll use the word creative polymathy. Creative polymathy can be recognized as active engagement in multiple interests, mixing and integrating vocations and or avocations, either simultaneously or serially over a lifetime. So there are lots of different pathways through that definition as to how to be a polymath, and whether you're connecting your just dual career, or whether you're doing things simultaneously, or one at a time, or whether you're connecting lots of avocations in there at the same time. Privately, you go home and you do something that's feeding your vocation, but one of the basic elements of that definition is that it's active. And that's where we want to really distinguish, like say, between a passive dilettante who loves things, taking things in, he or she, but they're not necessarily trying to do something with that. They're not making something. I mean, even if it's just go home and knit, you're making something. And so there's a process there that you're engaging in. So there's a difference between, reading, knitting books and never knitting anything, and then actually knitting something. And then actually not just knitting from pattern, but trying to knit your own stuff, making your own patterns up. So there are gradations in there. And so we're focused on the polymath is actively. They want to experience things on their own and do on their own.
And the connecting is also very important for us because, so one of my experiences when I was an undergraduate, I happened to be at someone's house and met this guy who I think had 27 master's degrees. And I was like, wow, so what do you do with all of them? He says, I just love learning. And I mean, as I pressed him, he literally he wasn't interested in doing anything with his knowledge. He simply loved the process of being in the classroom and learning things. And I thought, wow, that's really strange. I mean, maybe I'm just too utilitarian, but to me, the idea of knowing a great deal and then never using it for anything, the activity is really important, but you could be a historian and a philosopher and link those two things. So in that sense, you're not making anything like knitting, but you're using those two fields and putting them together in a new way and maybe writing something. So you're still producing something.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe the activity, again, all of the terms we've just used can have many different meanings depending on what the products are for different fields, which is another area which makes this very interesting and difficult.
But one thing we could say is that the polymath is not only a consumer of the knowledge of
producer is a good use,
it does something.
Yeah.
And would you like to expand on the vocation, avocation dichotomy?
Sure. So, I mean, one of the things that we've seen in studies of creativity and polymaths that have been doing polymathy so far is something of a debate as to whether we look at product or process. And there are people in the field right now who want to define a polymath as someone who is of Leonardo da Vinci stature. Which is virtually impossible for anybody to succeed at throughout history, let alone at the present. And that idea that you have to have succeeded and you have the products out there and have been recognized at a very high level in order to one field to be a polymath seems to us to be problematic. And in part that just comes out of our focus is much more on process. And how you generate the product, not what the product ends up being. We have pretty much I guess it's sort of an assumption, which could be wrong, but it's testable at least, which is that to be creative, you have to take ideas, problems, techniques, something from more than one field and put them together. And that just sort of comes with the definition of what creativity is. And since we're talking about polymaths being people who are productive, they're making something, they're active, then they are going to be producing something. So they're going to be taking all their knowledge and putting it together in some way. So that gets us back to the process. So if I'm not looking at the product, I'm looking at it in terms of, was this person extremely successful in many different fields? We believe you to be a polymath who has a product, which is maybe an interdisciplinary thing that comes together at an intersection. Mm-hmm. And the critical thing in being a polymath is that process to getting there. It could be two well-defined fields. You could be producing something that is both science and art and gets recognized in both. But you could also have this thing that's some hybrid. And that hybrid could be something that came out of professional training on the one hand, but doing something like music or art or photography on the side, which you never try to actually display or produce, perform in public, and yet has all the crucial elements that, combined with your professional training, create this new hybrid thing. So vocation could be just as important to putting things together as having a vocational output or a double vocation or things like that for us.
Yeah, I wanted to say two things about that. First, I think we got sensitized to it. I certainly did when we were working on Sparks of Genius, where we were looking at, say, the skills you use to think through ideas, and realized that a scientist could be using observing and then would say, I learned how to do this through my art. So but the art part for the scientist was never a vocation. It was simply something they did on the side. It was an avocation. So I think we got sensitized to that, feeling there's a critical connection. There can be a critical connection between someone's avocations and their vocation. And then just subsequent research, I did a lot of work looking at play. That was one of the skills we looked at in Sparks of Genius. And I got interested in that and started looking at very complex kinds of play. and would read about some of these people, like the example I wanted to bring up now was Tolkien, who we all know who he is, but we don't, and we all know that basically he was a philologist. So he loved language, he loved to make up languages, he liked to construct them. And he did that from a young age, and he went into a profession where he could professionally teach and write about, origins of language and stuff like that. At the same time, as a very, very private and secret vice, he called it, for a long time, he would go home and he would write. He would create these what they were imaginary constructed languages. And then he would start these elvish languages, and then he started writing stories that were set. It was a long process, but he ends up writing Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and stuff like that. And so you have this vocation feeding the avocation, because the avocation is actually in some ways, which maybe not obvious to us, the avocation initially was feeding the vocation, at least inspirationally. And actually, he does speak about his avocational language construction as kind of an experiment in how languages are put together. So they feed both each other. And then in his case, what happens basically is the avocation becomes all-consuming and actually becomes a vocation to him, because he gains renown, he gains public renown in the avocation. And he has to come clean to his colleagues at some point. Oh yeah, I've been doing this thing on the side, So that's a very interesting trajectory. But I would say they feed both ways, but we're most aware of how the vocation fed the avocation.
Herbsheim is another good example. So Michele mentioned in her talk that his big thing was decision making. He could justify doing anything he did by there's decision making involved in it. And one of the stories that I think is interesting was he loved chess. Well, he never became a professional chess player. I mean, this was always an application, and it didn't even last that long. But one of the things he got out of that was what we now call the 10,000-hour rule for learning something. So, how do you learn how to make the right decisions or the best decisions in chess? So he takes his application, it becomes a subject. You end up with this paper, which is now famous in psychology, for it takes 10,000 hours to master a new phenomenon, a new field, and basically drops it at that point. So the vocation becomes an excuse to do a study, which becomes very famous and sort of feeds into his work, but it never develops any further in that sense. So it's really critical to understanding. One of his most important contributions in psychology, if you look at him in terms of a chess player, he's not a great chess player, he never did much else with it. So.
That goes back to Howard Gruber's concept of networks of enterprise. So for the polymathic person, it doesn't matter so much if it's avocation or vocation, they are going forward, pursuing their interests. So it's more society that tries to categorize the interests.
I would say one more thing, which we didn't cover at all today in any way, but that if you do something avocationally, it takes the pressure off. You don't have to succeed at it. You don't have to be great at it. But you can still learn and experience and whatever. So that's a benefit from doing something avocationally. You lower the risk level. I think Gruber makes that point really when he's talking about the network. So many things, when something gets really dicey in one area and the risk becomes too much for you, whether it's social, personal, or whatever, you can kind of move into another area of your network and calm down.
And the process of recognition is very capricious. So you never know. And Tolkien could be dead and we never knew about this work. It's capricious.
I think another aspect of that is also I sort of noticed that we don't have any direct evidence of this in the sense it's just something I keep seeing is that what the level at which you need to know something in order to make connections is either like methodological, so you learn how to play the piano, you learn about certain kinds of patterns that are there, and now you can apply them in your geology because there are similar patterns or something. or principles. So you don't have to be the best, whatever, piano player in order to see that the principle of the pattern can be applied over here. But if you don't know how to play the piano and you've never been introduced to music theory, you would never make that connection. And so again, for us, it's not the level of attainment you make, but rather what level are you thinking about it. And so I think that's another thing the skills that I have to address is connections don't have to be at the level of I'm a phenomenal artist and I'm a phenomenal scientist and I'm a phenomenal gymnast and whatever it is, the Leonardo kind of thing. It's at what level can I make the connection so that network can be made at many levels and that network becomes a really interesting concept.
That goes back to the field studying much more the product, and which can lead to very problematic, how can I say, not assumptions, thinking, very problematic, how can I say, conclusions. Let me go back. So that goes back to the field going too much into the product. It leads to very problematic conclusions, right? When you look at
So,
the process.
and I think another aspect of that, which people haven't done enough studies on. I mean, there are a number of people who've written articles saying, it's ridiculous to think that some famous scientist could also have been, Madonna, or that Madonna could have been a phenomenal mathematician or something like that, as if the whole idea of having a modern Renaissance person can't exist, which turns out not to be true. When you actually look, what happens is that lots of people get defined in one field and we ignore the fact they have a reputation in another field, or they hide it. And so this is one of the things I keep seeing is people hiding things. I can remember talking with an extremely famous female physicist who didn't want me to tell anybody, and this is a private kind of thing, but she said, it's very strange because I go home and practice 4 hours a day on the piano, and I have a second career playing semi-professionally, and I don't tell anybody about this because how do I go tell my colleagues who are working 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, thinking that if they just put more time in, they're going to be more successful? And here I am, I've got a Nobel Prize and I've done this phenomenal work. And I'm, from their perspective, playing 4 hours a day instead. So, that's one aspect. The other thing is people publish, so there are several Nobel Prize winners who have written very well-known novels that were translated into 23 languages and things like that. But it was under a pseudonym.
Do you think that in the future organizations could be better to foster polymathy and to appreciate that people have this and organizations could harness this?
So yes and no. So I mean, one of the things I certainly see in my career is that my colleagues don't want to know that I'm doing something else. They have enough difficulty succeeding doing their one thing, and me going off and doing artwork or doing creativity studies for them is a waste of time. And so, I mean, you'd have to change not just an organization's perspective on polymaths, but the entire society's concept of polymaths to say, well, some people do this and it's okay, and I'm not that way. And I think this is actually something we need to be careful about. We don't want to make the polymath somebody you put up on a pedestal and this is what we should all be. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, there are different ways of succeeding. We need specialists as well as generalists and all these different kinds of things. And it's trite to say that, but that is the reality. And when if you go off and you start saying we should all be polymaths and we have to value the poly, right now, yes, they're not valued. It makes it very difficult. The real problem, and I think we've discussed this somewhat before, is what role does the polymath play in an institution? So this, I don't think it even has to be the Renaissance type polymath. Just to give you an example, I used to do a lot of consulting for the pharmaceutical industry, and there was one industry where basically the company only hired organic medicinal chemists. They ended up inventing something which could be robotized. So it was a process where they needed to now make this, machine, and you would now basically program the machine to do what the organic chemist did, but it could do it much faster and do a lot more of it, right? Very exciting. Well, now all of a sudden you have to hire people who know programming and can make a robot. First of all, they didn't want those other people. We hire organic chemists. Second, they didn't know what to do. How do you talk to a guy who's a computer programmer? I never talked to a computer. This really scared people. And so one of my jobs was actually to be the liaison. It was even worse than that in some parts of the company. They had people who were doing molecular modeling. So they're people taking a compound and what the target was going to be. And they're generating this model and detail inside the computer and trying to figure out what chemicals should the organic chemists make. These people can talk. They were all trained as organic chemists at some level. But the idea that there was a model which was in a computer and I have to actually do a series of things with chemicals gave these two groups of people different languages. And again, one of my jobs was to get these two sets of organic chemists who had different training to talk to each other. And so that's how specialized we've gotten. And I think that's where some of the value of polymaths or polymathic training will come in. I think there's something like 1,000 different specialties you can get a PhD in right now. And many of these people do have to work with each other. And even people who are closely allied can't talk to each other, let alone across, having an economist or an accountant come in and say, well, what's the most economically feasible way of doing these chemical reactions? Well, if you're an organic chemist and you've never thought about, I have to take into account all this stuff about how much do the reagents cost and how much is it going to cost to get rid of the leftover stuff at the end, and is it going to require environmental protection protocols and all this? That's not part of their training, and they don't want to have to think about it. They don't have the language to talk to people who have to. And yet, a company has to be able to.
The company has to have
So
some people that are thinking along those lines.
Who's the person who knows all these different issues, can talk to all the different groups?
Maybe it's the
understand the
managerial,
language.
the whatever. Maybe the managers need to be polymathics, polymathically trained.
Okay, next question. Why does polymathy matter to you?
So, some of this comes just personally. Two examples of how I got involved in polymathy studies. So, you mentioned earlier, Michael, I was trained with Thomas Kuhn. So that's one of the stories. It's actually the second, so I'll start with the other one first, actually. So when I went to graduate school, the president of the university, the first thing he did was give us an introduction to a new class, which Michele probably doesn't remember, although she was in the class with me. And, said basically, there's only one thing I remember from this talk. And that was, there's one thing that you have to do. You're probably all very talented people with lots of interests and so forth. And that's what's great when you were an undergraduate. But you're now in graduate school and you're being trained for a profession. And in order to succeed, you must, and he literally said this, put on blinders and do one thing and one thing only well for the rest of your life. And I was sitting there in my chair going, boy, did I make a big mistake.
It was funny that you verbalized in this way.
And I thought first, my second thought was, this is very strange for a president of the university because he's the president of the university. He can't possibly have done what he's talking about. Because how would you, he was an economist, so, okay, fine, he's trained in economy, but and he's probably good at balancing the books. But that can't be all he's doing as the president. He's got all these other jobs. He has. And so how did he get all these other training? And clearly he's very successful. He's the president of a Ivy League university, right? And then I started thinking about, the people behind me. Like my father was one of the first computer programmers. He was quite successful, and he wasn't like that at all. And I knew a lot of his friends who were other people in the field, and they're the ones who basically created computer programming. They weren't like that, and, on and on. And then as I started doing all my PhD in history of science, like Louis Pasteur is this phenomenal artist that is really important to how he devises his experiments and makes his apparatus, and on and on and on. These counterexamples. This is very strange because this advice doesn't make any sense for what I've seen from very creative, successful people. And then the second thing was I'm working with Kuhn, and he is one of the books that I was working as his research assistant. So he would give me the chapters, and I had to, proofread them and check all the references and all that kind of stuff. And one of them was a book of collected essays. And, on the way to mail off the manuscript to the publisher, he says, what do you think of the book? And we got along well enough that I was willing to literally give him my real impression. That's how good our relationship was. He could say anything to me, I could say anything to him. We'd have a discussion and that kind of thing. So it was like 4 classics, which I think everybody in history of science should read. There's 4 or 5 which are really history and physics is way too detailed. There are a couple that are sort of marginal in terms of the interest level to other people. And then there's one bad one. So which one is that? And I said, well, I think it's the last one in the book. And so it's the one on whether art has paradigm shifts. So does art have revolutions like science? And basically you make the argument, no, it doesn't. And I think that's wrong because in order to do that, you change the definition of what a paradigm is. And you can do all these weird things which are not very kosher. And then on top of that, all of the examples you give from the arts seem to be questionable. I don't know enough about what you're talking about, but I do know, just because I've been in enough museums, my parents were always talking about art. We have art books that every example that you give, I can give 10 counterexamples just off the top of my head. I can't even imagine what an art historian could do to this essay. And he asked me some questions. And we get to the post office. I go inside, mail off the manuscript, come back, he changes the subject, and we'll never talk about it again. So I'm left with this huge hole. So did I offend him? Was he convinced and didn't want to talk about it? What was going on here? And that left a big hole. So, I've got this president of the university saying, put your blinders on, don't do anything else. I'm really interested in art. I'm always doing art. Kuhn's saying art and science have nothing to do with each other, but for me, they're like integral because I'm totally visual. When I think about things, I'm always drawing them out. I can't see doing one without the other. And, here I have maybe offended him, maybe I'm wrong, he won't talk about it. So I had to now start formally investigating.
2 things. Have you ever figured out what happened with Kuhn?
I heard, and I don't know that this is true, but I heard, and then a couple of years later, I had a graduate friend when I was in grad school who said that he gave a lecture where he actually said that they were very similar in the way they developed. So he may have changed his mind. He never wrote it out. I did give him a chance to respond formally. So after I got my MacArthur, one of the first essays I wrote was actually about paradigm shifts in art, I think it was the Art Journal. And when I sent it to the editor of the journal, I said, I'd really like to have Kuhn have a chance to respond to that, because this is a direct counter to that particular essay, which I quoted from. And I think it would be really interesting to have this. So they invited him, and he refused. So again, I don't know.
How close was that to when he died? I mean, he
He died a year or two later.
He
so
may not,
Yeah.
not have been, he may be.
Might be not
I think
efficient.
he died of, he smoked, right? He was a chain
Yeah.
smoker. I think he died of lung cancer.
He may not have been able to.
Do you know what I find interesting about those two stories about the president of Princeton and then also about your story about Kuhn is that in the structure of scientific revolutions, Kuhn talks about there's normal science, but then these anomalies start piling up, and then that's what leads to these paradigm shifts. And that's exactly what happened to you, because Princeton was saying, this is the paradigm, this is the way to be, and then you were comparing all these anomalies where people were very successful because they weren't blind. They didn't have the blinders on. So I think that's an interesting combination of the two stories you shared.
Yeah, and I think that's, my answer to that would be to the question of why does it matter? Why does polymathy matter?
Yes.
It's a very personal response. And I think that's, and let me tell why. Basically that when we got involved in creativity studies in the beginning, in the first place, we were not trained as psychologists. We were coming from history of science, and we felt that these backgrounds made us eminently reasonable students of what creativity is, and psychology didn't necessarily have to own the subject matter. But the truth was that that's where you were finding most of the work was being done. So we thought, well, what else can we bring to the study? And partly because Bob's approach had already been to look at individuals very carefully and the records of how they thought and what they had to say about how they thought, that we thought, well, we can bring this personal approach, not only in who we study and how we study them qualitatively or phenomenologically or whatever, but we could try to experience it ourselves. And of course, Bob was already experiencing this, but I'm thinking, when I started off like in history, I thought that I was creative. Historians don't even ask themselves about what it means to be a creative historian. I never heard anyone pose that question at all. So I said, well, I don't know if I have a creative bone in my body. What does that mean? But what I can do is I can try to see what's there. And so I, at some point, said, okay, well, to give myself some experience of this, I think what I'll do is I enjoyed writing poetry up to a point. I never really studied it in any formal way. But I was drawn to very short forms. I was drawn to haiku. And I thought, okay, I know there are these haiku journals out there. There's this community of people. And I'm looking at these journals initially, and I don't know what the heck they're doing. How come these poems are chosen and something that I write isn't? Because I did try, submitting at first, and almost everything was rejected. Except one, but I didn't understand why the one was taken. See, that was the thing. So I said, okay, I'm going to see if I can crack this nut, if we figure out what this particular craft is all about, craft art, what it's about, and if I can start getting published, that means that I've begun to understand the aesthetic and I'm putting things together, and it's a kind of a learning process, and I'm becoming creative in a sense, at least personally creative. So I did that, and I got very hooked into it, and I couldn't give it up. But that kind of leads into the polymathy thing, because at some point when I began realizing that the work we were doing was really focusing on polymathy, that people were doing more than one thing. And then I realized, oh, I'm doing more than one thing. I'm trying to do this creativity studies, and I'm trying to do this haiku. And I did see connections between the two. In fact, I started writing for the haiku journals. I'd written 2 or 3 articles about taking how haiku is creative, not how it's creative, but how the poem itself is like this little nugget of what creativity is. That it's based on this idea of putting 2 things together, and there's this little explosion that has to happen in the reader's mind. So anyway, the point was I started connecting them, at least on a content level, saying that they could inform.
Thought processes, right? You've written several processes.
Well, okay, I meant, because we were looking at content process, yeah, but whatever, connecting them on different levels. And so, so I think it came to me as a personal kind of experiential thing. And then of course you start thinking about it, think, gee, if we had been in our own, if we had been trained, or at least taught to think about some of these things earlier in our lives, what kind of difference might have made when you
Another thing that I think probably filtered in for both of us, which we became pretty explicit about very early, was, and partly this is just comparing ourselves to some of the other people who are working on creativity studies, not necessarily polymathic per se, but we noticed that there were people who were, supposedly like experts in creativity in the arts. And as we got to know them, we found out that they not only didn't do art, even when they were offered, like a very famous friend who is an artist and also does creativity, and we offered to give them art lessons. And he had come to the same conclusion we were. One of the reason he wanted to give them the lessons was he said, you're asking the wrong questions. You're looking at this as a total outsider, which, you're also not being objective. You may think you're being objective, but you don't understand what an artist does, so you don't even know what question to look at or what kind of study to do to get at what is creative and things like that. And so we became very explicit that if we are going to study something like polymathy, you have to try it, you have to do it. Doesn't mean you have to be successful, doesn't mean you have to be the greatest, whatever. But in order to understand what the questions are, and in order to understand what Polymath is doing, the best way is to try and actually be polymathic yourself. And even if you're failing, you're still going to, as your failures will tell you a whole bunch about, what makes somebody successful. And once I had that insight, we were very explicit talking about it. I suddenly realized, when I go to a concert, lots of people don't hear what I'm hearing when a cellist or violinist or whatever is playing. I'm not a fantastic violinist or child. I played the cello for 10 or 12 years. But I realized that training keyed my ear, it told me things about technique and so forth. So when I watch a cellist and I listen to a cellist, I'm getting a completely different experience than somebody who's never played a stringed instrument before. And it also tells me that when I listen to somebody playing the trombone, I may get a little bit more because I have a trained ear. But I'm also missing all sorts of stuff because I don't know anything about the techniques of playing a trombone. So I don't know whether this guy's faking this part or doing it really well or that kind of thing. And so in both those cases, I'm at least having insights about what I need to know and what questions I would need to ask an expert. Where if I didn't know anything about music and I went and sat in there and went, okay, so what makes you creative? Dumb question, but that's actually what people sometimes do.
Yeah, I have one interesting thing. Let me process this question. Let me talk about one thing that I wanted. Okay. You mentioned about the process, and you're very visual, Bob. And in fact, we have this bias that we only look to the products of people that were famous and just some of the products, and then it leads to conclusions like this person is a mathematical thinker. And what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, so I'm not sure I don't think we can define any thinking in terms of products or in terms of disciplines. And Michele actually addressed this directly in Sparks of Genius. We think that what we see as products are ways of expressing your insights. And one of the fun things I think about interaction between science and art, or science and music, or music and art, or any of these things, is there are lots of people who end up in these polymaths we're talking about, who have the ability to actually express their insights in more than one domain or formal language or whatever you want to talk about it. There's one really famous example physicist name, maybe, probably. I think it's Dirac, I'm not absolutely sure. Who, when you look at his papers, everything he ever published is equations. And they're incredibly dense. They're virtually impossible to read. I can remember when I was working for Kuhn having tried to struggle through a couple of these papers. And it's pure logic distilled down to the most condensed form. And the biographer, when I finally got a hold of a biography of him, it was just a total eye-opener because it turned out that all of his work was actually done visually. He had all these drawings and sketches. He destroyed them all except he missed it before he died. He didn't want anybody to know how he actually thought, because at that time in the particular culture he was in, which was coming out of a specific area of math, pure logic was the only thing that was acceptable. And visual thinking, images, diagrams were not. And so he tried to cover up for his reputation that that's not how he thought. And this is why everything was so rigorous. I mean, it's beyond what almost anybody else was doing, because he was trying to make himself into this thing he wasn't, in order to pass himself off as a great scientist. He was, but I mean, this was not where his creativity was. So, the way he expressed himself had nothing to do with it.
It was a public communication.
Right.
I mean, you have to. I mean, you can come up with ideas in many ways that are completely private, idiosyncratic. No one else would think that way. But you can't express. Then you can't communicate it to someone else. So we do need these public languages, which are words, numbers, also visual arts and dances and whatever. We have a lot of different kinds of languages to express ideas in.
Barbara McClintock's another really wonderful example. So she's well known for where she discovered something called jumping genes. Chromosomes can rearrange, got a Nobel Prize for that. And she was well known for talking about getting down there, having a feeling for the organism and how it wanted to work, and all these really touchy-feely kinds of
Being
things.
friends with them.
Friends with them. It was very strange language, and professionals in the area used to talk about where the ideas come from would be completely incomprehensible. She would try to explain to people what she was doing, and it was so non-scientific in the standard way we think about it that nobody could understand. And I had stumbled across some of this stuff. She got a MacArthur, I think the same time I did her in the next round. And I can remember calling her up and saying, I'd really like to talk to you about this stuff. And she said, I will not talk about it. I am so unique. There's nobody else who does this. Nobody would understand. You certainly wouldn't understand. And it was partly a female-male bias she had.
But she wasn't.
But she wasn't. I mean, we discovered as we were going through our research that there were lots of other people who talked about this as well. But these were all private languages for them. And they all talked about this translation problem of how do I take these insights and turn them into a formally communicable version that I can discuss with other people. And it could be a drawing, it could be anything, it didn't matter. But these inside things we have are ours and they're nobody else's.
I wonder sometimes if the growing presence of women in science, for instance, might change some of that out, where we become more willing to discuss how we really think, initially, how ideas come to us. There are a lot of women scientists, for instance, who are studying animal behavior, and almost all of them will admit to using empathizing, basically, which makes perfect sense. Other men who are studying animals also use empathizing, maybe don't want to talk about it much, because it's a natural way to approach that kind of science. But I'm wondering, as they become, I think maybe the culture is loosening up, so we become more willing to discuss how we come to some of our ideas and then translate them into more rigorous logical language. Because Jane Goodall, for instance, did a lot of emphasizing with her subjects, and she, I think, struggled with how to translate that into something she could, that the male-dominated, logic-dominated science would accept. But then as she became more famous, it was like not so much of a secret anymore. Yeah, that's how I do it. and continue to do that.
Yeah.
So,
Michael and I have had this very conversation that, it's sort of one skill to be able to ideate and think of new things in your mind. And it's a totally different skill set to be able to get it out and convey it so that others can understand it. Two different skill
I had
sets.
a wonderful experience of this while I was consulting one time. So this group of people who I knew very well, and I know them for probably a year and a half, something. So we got together every week, a couple of hours. So they're sitting there working on a problem, and all of a sudden, I must have just blanked out because I can remember one of them going, Bob. And I can remember just like raising my hand and saying, 1 second. And they just continued their discussion in the background and let me do whatever I was doing. And I had this, insight as to how to solve this problem, and I had no idea
How to get it out.
Well, first I wasn't quite sure how to define what I was doing. It was just like this flash of inspiration that I think I've seen how, and then I had to work through in my own mind how this, and then I had no way to explain it. And afterwards I said, I've got the solution to the problem. I can't tell you. I'll come back next week with it. And I spent, several days back in my office trying to figure out, okay,
how to put into
how
language.
do I explain this to people? Because the way I came to this is so bizarre.
Was the way you came to that solution sort of pre-verbal? Was it?
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
It was a completely visual thing of overlapping. I've actually had 3 of these things, which I can remember in great detail.
That's
And so then the question was, all right, how do I tell somebody about this?
Yeah, that capacity is a unique phenomenon within a polymathic kind of brain, I think, as well, because you can have a group of people who are from different domains and fields, but in order to integrate information and come to solutions, they have to go through this barrier called language. But if you have had broad exposure and are ideating and can come to a unique, innovative solution in your own head, you're not dependent upon language necessarily to do that. And that's something unique to polymathic thinking that you can't get from a group of people necessarily.
One great contribution of polymathic studies is to shed light on how the real processes of thinking of how those products came to be. Because of our bias in the past studies, we came to conclusions that appear to be that wrong. And polymathic studies is a great way to shed light on how, and be honest on how things are happening, on how science is being made.
That's a great insight, actually.
I was actually going to say, I think that's one of the big challenges for polymathic studies going forward is getting inside polymaths' heads and figuring out what are the connections. So, Michele and I think, sort of came about this in some ways backwards in the sense that we started with sparks of genius and the tools, which was one approach. And clearly visual thinking and empathizing, some of these are going to be part of it. Where are the connections being made? How are they being made? Do all polymaths have this problem of then translating into a formal language? Does it matter whether you're doing artwork for yourself? Does Picasso have the same problems that Einstein does? Can Picasso just paint his painting and you like it and you don't, or whatever it happens to be, versus Einstein having to put it into math and somebody going through it? And, I don't know. These are really challenging questions.
No, I was just going to say, this reminded me, we've talked about this before, the Dr. Spock, or not Dr. Spock, Mr. Spock, Mr. Spock, and he can just go up and go, and if we could do that, then a group of polymaths who are each separate, group of specialists who are trying to solve a common problem could, do that, and then they could get the direct pre-verbal thinking of others, and maybe they could work as a polymathic brain, a huge polymathic brain.
Perhaps artificial intelligence will do that.
Maybe that's what our...
But then the other question is, if I don't have in my brain what you have in your brain, and I directly get it, do I actually get everything?
Can I
there's
process
no place
it?
to put it. If I have no experience that's equivalent, I may get your experience, but it doesn't connect to anything, so maybe I don't get the full
Yeah.
And so
connection.
how much is Mr. Spock getting? Is he just
Yeah.
getting the knowledge content, or is he getting the
So,
whole
I mean,
experiences
these
you've
are
ever
really
had and how you
fascinating.
think, you know,
Yeah.
and whatever?
But
Which makes the argument for broad exposure and having lots of
Yeah.
tools in your toolkit more relevant, because whether you're coming up with innovations on your own or even in a group, you're going to be better able to understand the elements that you're
going
looking
back
at.
to the question whether Leonardo and Picasso have the same problems, well, for sure, they have one problem in common. They have to learn. And the ability to learn is definitely an ability that's very well exercised by polymaths. And something else, we have this phenomenon from biology of convergent evolution. So sometimes we have problems that different animals solve in different ways, but like wings, bat wings are totally different from bird wings. But I think if we have this Spock kind of intelligence, we could relate because we have common problems. Our way of thinking about them is idiosyncratic. Our experiences are, but I think the problems have a common root. Yeah.
Okay.
The last one?
Next, how are we doing on time?
We have like almost 1 hour, so it's
Okay,
better to
let's
ask
try-
the last one.
Okay. Can I ask two more? They're kind of related. They're kind of the flip side. Okay. What excites you most about the field of polymath studies?
I guess for me, it's the potential for altering the educational system. I think, right now we're coming out of a 19th century specialized learn how to do a particular thing, and you'll probably get into a factory and do a repetitive thing over and over and over again for the rest of your life. The educational system hasn't caught up with the fact that we're moving into a knowledge economy. That people have to be fluent, they have to be able to learn new skills continuously, they need to interact with people across many disciplines because, just look at Amazon. Amazon doesn't just sell books. Amazon sells everything, and it's into delivery, and it's into, what isn't it doing now, right? So, anybody working at these kinds of places is no longer just going to learn how to make a car part and put it into the car engine in this place and whatever. That's just not what jobs are anymore. So how are we going to educate people to be these autodidactic learners who continuously can and want to learn throughout their lives? How are we going to give them the languages and the background so that they can interact with people across many disciplines, know enough of the different disciplinary languages to understand what the real problems are, and then come to integrated solutions and carry them out. This is what polymathy is all about.
I think that the educational aspect is really, really important. I think one other thing that really, that I'm very interested in that I think is really important is just on a personal level, on an individual level, people kind of re-owning their human right to participate fully in a culture. We've gotten ourselves in a position now where we do so much passively. We watch sports instead of doing them. We watch concerts instead of learning how to make music on our own, on and on and on, right? And it's kind of civilization, the way where we're at right now, has kind of divorced us from this owning what human culture is and trying to participate as fully as possible in what it means to be human. So that's, to me, what, on a personal level, what polymathy means.
I love that. Last question. What do you wish most for the future of the field of polymath studies?
I guess the thing I wish most is for more people to get excited and do the research and start applying it. And probably that means having more polymaths. We're all polymaths here. That's why we got interested. That's what we want to be doing. And so part of this is, as Michele just said, making sense of our lives as well as helping out society. So the more people we get excited about this and the more people who get involved in it, the more progress we're going to make and the more possibilities we'll see.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, there are a lot of unanswered questions. I think what we've tried to do is raise a lot of questions.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have the last word. We only have maybe a beginning word to prod other people into finding out more
Yeah.
about the phenomenon.
Yeah. There's a lot of power in asking really great questions, even if you don't have the answers yet.
That's proper. That's proper.
Yeah. Well, this has been so great. Thank you for your time and for your brains and for your energy and your enthusiasm. It was really great to chat with you and such an honor to be here with you.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Michael Rocky.
Angela Catalessa.
Root-Bernstein.
Michele Root-Bernstein.
Thank you.
All right.